The chandeliers in Buckingham Palace sparkled, but there was no warmth in the room. King Charles III sat at the head of the polished oak table, his fingers laced, his jaw tight. Across from him sat a man who didn't belong in the palace, or so the king believed. Ibrahim Traoré's uniform bore no medals, no golden fringe, but the fire in his eyes needed no decoration. "Why is he even here?" whispered Lord Melgrave, the Foreign Office advisor, leaning toward the king. "He should be addressing the Commonwealth, not confronting the crown." Charles didn't answer. His gaze was locked on Traoré, who, for a moment, simply looked around the room, portraits of conquests, maps of dominions, the echo of empires long buried under denial. Then, without warning, Traoré spoke. "I see you still sit under a stolen crown." Gasps erupted around the room. Charles's face remained stoic, but his voice turned cold. "Watch your tongue. You're in a kingdom that wrote the rules of the world." Traoré didn't blink. "And broke every one of them." The room froze. This wasn't diplomacy, it was a reckoning. "I brought you here as a courtesy," Charles said. "Because I still believe in order. In civility. And I came," Traoré replied, standing slowly, "to tell you that civility ends when theft is dressed as tradition." Lord Melgrave stood up in protest. "You dare threaten His Majesty?" Traoré raised one hand, silencing the room. His eyes never left Charles. "You said the crown's on your head?" he asked quietly. Charles nodded, chin lifted. Traoré stepped forward. "Then I'll knock it off." You could hear a pin drop. The security guards tensed. The diplomats didn't know whether to intervene or observe. But Charles, he didn't move. He only stared. Not because he wasn't angry, but because for the first time in decades, a man had spoken to him not like a monarch, but like a man with blood on his hands. And Traoré didn't come for conversation. He came for history. The next few seconds inside the royal chamber felt longer than history itself. Traoré's words didn't just challenge Charles's authority, they shattered the unspoken contract of centuries, the one where the global South stayed silent in rooms built by their colonizers. Charles leaned back in his chair, trying to gather the shredded fragments of diplomacy. "You seem to think this is a battlefield." "It is," Traoré replied calmly. "Only your weapons are paintings, and your victories are written by those who never bled." Lord Melgrave attempted to intervene again. "Mr. Traoré, you are a guest in this house. Anne. This house was built with what you stole from ours," Traoré cut in, his voice sharp, precise. "Don't speak to me of hospitality in a palace where our gold lines your ceilings." Charles's fingers clenched. "We moved past that. That was another time. The world has changed." Traoré stepped closer. "Has it? Or did you just change the locks and keep the loot?" The king's face reddened, not from rage, but from the humiliation of having no rebuttal. Every word from Traoré struck with the weight of generations. He wasn't debating, he was reclaiming. And yet, behind Charles's rigid posture, a flicker of doubt formed. Because part of him, deep, hidden beneath titles and oaths, knew this man wasn't lying. Across the room, a young aide recording the meeting dropped her pen. It was supposed to be a quiet exchange. A symbolic gesture. England would meet the rising African leadership, smile for the cameras, shake hands, then return to the old ways. But Traoré hadn't come to smile. He came to tell the king, "The sun has finally set on your empire." "Is this what you call diplomacy?" Charles asked tightly. "No," Traoré said. "This is memory." The silence that followed Traoré's words was not empty, it was loaded. Loaded with centuries of silence, with stolen voices buried under polished stone and royal etiquette. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't pounded the table. But everyone in the room felt the air shift like a thunderclap in a chapel. Charles stood now. Slowly. Not in defiance, but in defense. You believe you speak for justice, he said, walking to the window. But you are not the first to challenge the crown. We've heard many like you. No, Traore said. You've heard many who wanted your approval. I don't. The king turned, startled by the directness. For a man barely in his 30s, Traore didn't seem to carry the weight of insecurity. He carried something sharper, conviction. I was told you came to discuss trade, Charles said. I came to discuss theft. Charles exhaled. If this is how you see the world, then we have nothing more to say. Then I'll speak for both of us. The guards flinched. Traore reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and placed a small velvet pouch on the table. Everyone watched. Charles eyed it, confused. Open it, Traore said. The king hesitated, then nodded to an aide. She opened the pouch and gasped. Inside, a single gold coin. Worn, ancient, and unmistakably stamped with the royal crest of England, from the 19th century. Underneath, a folded photograph. A child holding an empty bowl in a dry village. The background showed a British mining company sign, long abandoned. This is your legacy, Traore said. A coin in London. Hunger in Wahiguya. You don't understand the complexity, Charles began. I understand perfectly, Traore interrupted. You want order. I want justice. The two don't live in the same palace. Charles's hands were shaking slightly now. Not from fear, but from the sudden realization that this wasn't political theater. This was the confrontation every monarch dreads, the mirror of consequences. And Traore wasn't finished. You speak of justice like it's yours to deliver, Charles said, the old pride returning to his voice. But your country, your continent, still depends on our systems. Our markets. Our aid. Traore smiled, not kindly, but like a man who had heard this song before, too many times. Your aid, he said slowly. You mean interest-bearing loans wrapped in flags? Or the military bases parked near every mineral deposit? Charles's eyes narrowed. Careful. You're treading into dangerous accusations. No accusation. Just arithmetic, Traore said. What you give, you've already taken 100 times over. And now, you dress it in charity. Behind them, the aide had stopped taking notes. Even the guard seemed frozen, no longer ready to intervene, but caught in the unfolding gravity of the moment. Traore walked toward the grand fireplace, lined with portraits of colonial expeditions. His fingers trailed along the marble mantel. Do you know what this is made of? He asked, tapping the stone. Stolen Congolese marble. Cut by hands that were chained. The room shrank with shame. Charles's voice, though lower, was still firm. You think breaking the symbols of power changes the world? These institutions hold nations together. No, Traore replied. They hold your world together. Mine was broken to build it. And then he turned fully toward the king. I didn't come to negotiate. I came to announce. Burkina Faso is pulling out of the Commonwealth. We will no longer recognize the crown's relevance in our diplomacy, in our economy, or in our future. The announcement hit harder than any raised voice could have. A declaration not of war, but of severance. You can't simply walk away, Charles said, blinking, the weight of history crashing behind his words. I'm not walking, Traore said. I'm building, without your permission. The room erupted. Ministers gasped. The aide dropped her tablet. Guards stepped forward. But Traore didn't flinch. He had already set the terms. And now, he was about to walk into history, not by asking for a seat at the table, but by flipping the table itself. You've made your statement, Charles said sharply. Now what? You'll isolate yourself? Cut off centuries of cooperation because of old wounds? Traore met his gaze without blinking. They're not old wounds if they're still bleeding. A pause. Heavy. Unforgiving. Across the hall, an antique clock ticked like a metronome of a collapsing empire. Each second seemed to mock the illusion of permanence. You know, Traore continued, you British taught the world something, that power isn't taken politely. You colonized with flags and treaties, then called it civilization. And now, when we speak boldly, you call it rebellion. Charles clenched his jaw. You're twisting history. I'm untwisting it, Traore said. And what you see is uncomfortable. Charles took a step forward now, not as king, but as man. We tried to help. We gave scholarships. Infrastructure. We gave you a voice. No, Traore corrected, his voice cutting clean. You gave us a microphone, on a stage you built, with lines you wrote. The silence grew thick. And then, Traore did something no one expected. He reached into his inner pocket again and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. Folded once. He offered it to the king. Charles hesitated, then took it and opened it. It was a ledger. A simple one. 2 columns. Left, resources extracted from West Africa over 120 years, gold, cocoa, cotton, uranium. Right, total aid received from the UK in 60 years. At the bottom, a calculation. A negative balance, by billions. Traore said, that's your generosity. That's your aid. That's your version of partnership. Charles stared at the numbers. He said nothing. There's no moral crown, Traore said. Only metal on a head. But I came here to tell you something, Charles. He walked to the center of the room, turned slowly, and said it loud enough for every aide, every guard, every ghost in the room to hear. If you ever try to tighten your grip again, I'll tear that crown from your head, and I won't need an army to do it. For the first time, Charles didn't speak. Because for the first time, he believed him. Outside Buckingham Palace, rain had begun to fall, a quiet drizzle, as if the sky itself was unsure how to respond to what had just taken place inside its oldest throne room. Charles stood alone by the window now, staring out at the gates, the gathered media, the ripple of whispers already building across diplomatic circles. Behind him, Traore remained seated, not as a guest, but as an equal. Maybe more. I'm not here to destroy tradition, Traore said finally. But if tradition feeds on subjugation, then yes, I'll break it with both hands. Charles turned slightly. What happens when your rebellion breeds chaos? Traore raised an eyebrow. What happens when your silence sustains it? He stood now, slowly, deliberately, with that same measured defiance he had carried from the first moment. My people don't need your ceremonies. They need sovereignty. Not handshakes in royal halls. Not polished speeches. Roads. Schools. Clean water. And the dignity of saying no to your contracts. Charles's face darkened. You think you can build a nation on pride alone? No, Traore answered. I build it on truth. And truth, Charles, doesn't beg. The tension was no longer diplomatic. It was ideological. It wasn't just Traore versus Charles, it was the future versus the past, urgency versus legacy, fire versus porcelain. Traore approached one of the royal portraits hanging near the door, an oil painting of Queen Victoria surrounded by African subjects. He didn't touch it. He just looked. And then said softly, she ruled by sword and sermon. You rule by myth and memory. I lead by necessity. Charles didn't respond. Because he had no retort. Every word Traore had spoken was now echoing through the halls, through the walls, through the very foundation of the monarchy. Before leaving, Traore turned one last time. "Don't mistake my restraint for weakness," he said. "Next time I won't bring words." He walked out without a bow. And with that, the room, lined in gold, history, and ghosts, suddenly felt very small. By the time Traore stepped into his armored convoy outside Buckingham Palace, the headlines had already begun. Traore walks out, no bow, no apology. Burkina Faso leader challenges the crown head-on. A new voice in the global south, and it doesn't whisper. In the back seat of the car, Traore sat in silence, watching the rain streak the bulletproof window. His advisor, Amadou, sat across from him, eyes wide. "You shook the palace," Amadou whispered. Traore looked over. It was already crumbling. "I just spoke loud enough for them to hear it." Across London, at the BBC and CNN offices, analysts scrambled to interpret what had just happened. Former diplomats called it reckless. Activists called it revolutionary. But no one could ignore it. And back in Ouagadougou, crowds were forming in the streets. Young men with phones held high, old women with flags of red and green, chanting his name. Not like a celebrity. Like a leader. Like someone who hadn't knelt. At the British Foreign Office, alarms were quietly ringing. Charles had returned to his private chambers, shaken. Not because of violence. But because of something more dangerous, clarity. "He doesn't want aid," said a senior aide, pacing nervously. "He wants a reckoning." Traore wasn't seeking revenge. He was drawing a line, and daring the world to cross it. That night, he released a statement. It wasn't long. It wasn't polished. But it was loud. Burkina Faso will not be a client. Not to Britain. Not to any empire. We're not emerging, we've emerged. And we decide what comes next. It was translated into 27 languages by morning. At the African Union headquarters, diplomats from Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, and Tanzania called for a special session. Not to condemn him, but to ask, what if we followed? In France, emergency meetings were scheduled. In Washington, eyebrows were raised. And in London, one monarch sat in silence, wondering how a man from a land he once thought forgotten had just redrawn the map of influence in under 48 hours. Traore didn't overthrow a king. He dethroned an illusion. 2 days after the confrontation, Traore stood at the lectern of the African Union's emergency summit in Addis Ababa. The room was packed, presidents, prime ministers, envoys, and observers. For once, no one scrolled through their phones. Every ear was fixed on him. He didn't thank the hosts. He didn't exchange pleasantries. He opened with thunder. "I met a king who still thinks he owns what his great-grandfather stole." Gasps rippled through the hall. "He asked me to follow. I reminded him, we've already led rebellions. We just didn't put them on camera." The hall erupted in restrained applause, cautious, yet undeniable. Across the Atlantic, BBC World cut to live coverage. Fox News called it, "the arrogance of the Third World." Al Jazeera called it, "the rise of unapologetic sovereignty." Traore leaned forward. "This is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about the centuries of theft dressed up as civilization. The speeches, the summits, the aid, that all come with strings." He paused, surveying the faces of his African counterparts. "The question isn't whether Charles still wears a crown. The question is whether we still kneel to it." Silence. Heavy. Historic. A delegate from Ghana leaned into his mic, "And if we stand, what happens?" Traore didn't miss a beat. "Then we stop asking. And we start building." The next day, the African Union announced the formation of a sovereignty working group, tasked with reviewing all colonial-era agreements, trade dependencies, and foreign military installations. Within 48 hours, 5 countries froze negotiations with European contractors pending review. And King Charles? He released a statement through Buckingham Palace: "We regret any miscommunication and reaffirm our commitment to respectful global partnerships." It was the most diplomatic way to say, "We felt that slap." In Ouagadougou, murals of Traore began appearing overnight. Not as a messiah, but as a man who had spoken what others whispered. As he boarded a plane back home, a young journalist asked him at the tarmac, "Was this your revolution?" He turned to her, tired but resolute. "No. This was just the knock on the door. The revolution begins when the door opens." Back in London, Buckingham Palace was quieter than usual. No balls. No parades. Just whispered conversations in high-ceilinged rooms. Behind gilded curtains, advisors huddled around the king. Charles sat slumped in an armchair, reading the headline from The Guardian. The king was challenged, and the world listened. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The expression on his face, tight-lipped, jaw clenched, said enough. "They're saying Traore outmaneuvered us," one aide muttered. Charles finally responded, his voice like gravel. "He didn't outmaneuver me. He exposed us." The room went silent. Meanwhile, Traore had returned to a hero's welcome in Ouagadougou. Tens of thousands lined the streets. Flags waved. Children wore paper crowns, not to mock Charles, but to show who now wore the symbol of leadership in their eyes. Inside the presidential palace, Traore didn't celebrate. He met with his cabinet and issued one order. Start reviewing every foreign agreement signed before 1960. Everything. If it was signed in the shadow of a flag that wasn't ours, it's on the table. That same night, a letter arrived in London. Not through diplomats. Not through ambassadors. A direct message. From Traore. The letter read: "To King Charles III. You once ruled the sun. But it has set. This is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration of awareness. We know what was taken. We know what was promised. And now, we decide what returns." Charles didn't reply. Because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like history repeating itself. And for the first time, the monarch of one of the most powerful empires in human history realized. It wasn't Traore he had lost to. It was time. 1 month after the confrontation, Traore stood before a crowd in Ouagadougou's Independence Square. It wasn't a military parade. No pageantry. Just a single podium, a plain suit, and the man who had looked a king in the eye, and not blinked. The world watched. "We didn't ask for a fight," Traore began. "But we won't keep swallowing silence." Applause. Loud. Honest. Empires do not end when flags come down. They end when minds wake up. He gestured to a group of children holding history books, not written in Paris or London, but in Burkina Faso, by Burkinabe authors. "We won't burn bridges. But we won't be walked on either." Across the ocean, in classrooms and parliaments, his words became subjects of debate. Some labeled him dangerous. Others called him necessary. In London, Charles remained quiet. He resumed royal duties, but with less sparkle in the crown. His speeches were shorter. His steps, slower. Traore didn't destroy him. But he shifted the weight of that crown. In Africa, leaders began questioning long-standing agreements. Young people referenced Traore not as an icon, but as a signal that something new was possible. Something unbowed. Weeks later, a reporter from The Times asked Traore in an exclusive interview, "Do you consider yourself the man who challenged the monarchy?" Traore leaned forward with a calm smile. "No. I'm the man who reminded them their echo doesn't reach everywhere." The interview went viral. As he left the room, a guard asked quietly, "Do you think Charles will ever respond?" Traore didn't look back. He already did. He stood still. That night, a new mural was painted on the side of the presidential palace. It wasn't just Traore. It was a broken crown. Lying not shattered, but humbled. And beneath it, a single phrase in bold red. Respect is not inherited. It's earned. A king wore his crown. A soldier carried his voice. And history shifted. Ibrahim Traoré didn't need to raise an army. He raised a truth that couldn't be ignored. In a world still haunted by old empires, he didn't ask for a seat at their table. He flipped the table. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, that's what true power looks like today. Not gold. Not thrones. But the courage to speak. Even when the room is built to silence you. So the question now isn't whether Charles still wears the crown. The question is, who's really leading the future? If this story moved you, share it. Let the world hear the voices history tried to bury. This is the untold state. And we don't kneel to silence.